The clouds hung low over northern France in August 1914. A deceptive calm spread across the meadows, as if the land itself hadn't yet grasped the war that had just begun. Captain Edward Stroud of the British Expeditionary Force adjusted the reins of his horse, the leather stiff with recent oiling, his uniform freshly pressed despite the long journey across the Channel. Around him, the 2nd Cavalry Brigade stirred with anticipation, their lances upright, their eyes scanning the horizon for movement. Though war had erupted like a storm across Europe, the men of cavalry still held tight to old certainties, the belief that speed, daring, and steel could break the enemy's lines, as it had in generations past. Stroud was no romantic. He had seen the changing tide in military technology, the rise of machine guns, barbed wire, and long-range artillery. Yet beneath his rational assessments, he carried the weight of tradition. His grandfather had charged with the Light Brigade in Crimea. His father had worn the same sabretache in colonial India. To Stroud, this war was not only a campaign against Germany, but a test of whether the world he came from still had a place on the battlefield. As the brigade moved toward Mons, whispers ran through the ranks of a German force advancing faster than expected. Scouts had reported heavy cavalry across the river, Uhlans in polished pickelhaubes riding alongside riflemen on horseback. The thought thrilled some and chilled others. In many officers' minds, this might be the last great cavalry engagement in European history, if only they had known how true that would prove to be. Major Wilfred Carson, Stroud's second-in-command, rode beside him in a silence born not of tension, but calculation. "If the Germans deploy Maxim guns with their lancers," he said, "this will be a massacre." His voice was low, almost apologetic, as if dashing the romantic illusion felt like a betrayal. Stroud nodded but said nothing. Orders were clear: screen the infantry, probe enemy flanks, and, if possible, delay the advance long enough for General French to reposition the main body. They reached the edge of a wood that overlooked a small village. Smoke curled above the rooftops, not from artillery, but chimneys, as if unaware of the war rolling toward them. Civilians, mostly elderly and women with children, watched the brigade pass with a mixture of awe and fear. Stroud caught the eye of a young boy holding a wooden sword and felt a pang of guilt. War, once paraded as noble, was about to show its truest, darkest face. By mid-afternoon, the engagement began. Forward squadrons moved through hedgerows and across open farmland. The Germans struck hard and fast, their coordination chillingly precise. Horses collapsed under gunfire, sabers clattered onto bloodied ground, and the sound of shouting men gave way to the staccato rhythm of automatic rifles. The British cavalry fought bravely, but their formations broke under the brutal logic of modern warfare. A single machine gun could pin down an entire unit. Shock had lost its power against bullets that tore through flesh before a saber could be raised. Stroud rallied a detachment behind a stone wall, ordering them to dismount and return fire. "We're cavalry, not corpses," he growled, watching his men lay flat, their rifles cracking in reply to the German fusillade. The very idea of charging now seemed lunacy. He looked at the faces around him, not green recruits, but professional soldiers bred into an army still wearing the shadow of empire. Each one was questioning everything they had been taught. Through the smoke, a cluster of German cavalry appeared, perhaps unaware of the full strength hidden behind the wall. Instinct rose in Stroud. He mounted, raised his saber, and gave a yell, a cry more ancestral than tactical. Several followed. They surged forward, hooves pounding, blades gleaming. The Germans faltered under the sudden shock, but then rallied, rifles snapping to shoulders. The charge faltered as men and horses were shredded. Stroud's mount collapsed beneath him, and he hit the ground hard. The wind knocked from his lungs. He scrambled behind a tree, blood oozing from his temple. Carson arrived moments later, limping, his expression raw with disbelief. "It's madness," he said. "We're obsolete." The words hung in the air like a final sentence. No one argued. There was no room for glory here, only survival. Nightfall cloaked the countryside, and the surviving cavalry withdrew under cover of darkness. What was left of the brigade regrouped behind infantry lines. Tired faces, bloodied tunics, empty canteens. Stroud sat against a ruined wall, staring at the remnants of a unit that only hours before had seemed ready to gallop into legend. Now they were foot soldiers with horses that no longer carried hope. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of cavalry. Not entirely. There were still places where mobility might matter, where terrain or tactics could favor the horseman over the tank, the scout over the trench digger. But the Western Front was not that place. It was a grinder of tradition, a crucible that burned away sentiment and left only efficiency and death. As the stars emerged over the battered fields of Belgium, Stroud lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. Around him, the wind carried the scent of gunpowder and the low moans of the wounded. He exhaled slowly, letting the smoke blur the stars. This war would not be won with cavalry, he knew. But maybe, just maybe, the horsemen still had one last part to play in this new, terrible chapter of history. Rain slicked the cobblestones of the town of Ypres, and Captain Edward Stroud stood beneath the crumbling arch of a church, his boots soaked and his uniform smeared with weeks of grime. The cavalry was no longer on the move. It was entrenched, mired in a war that now sprawled and strangled like barbed wire across the French countryside. The romantic gallops of August had faded into a grueling, unending stalemate. His regiment had lost most of its horses, and those that remained were half-starved, hobbled by mud and exhaustion. Stroud's saber hung unused at his side, an ornament of a forgotten role. He watched the horizon through his field glasses, not searching for an enemy charge, but waiting for signs of artillery. The war was changing, and so were its soldiers. His men no longer spoke of bold charges or sweeping maneuvers. They spoke of rations, lice, and the endless rain. In the trenches beside them, infantrymen no longer looked at the cavalry with envy or awe, but with the blank weariness of shared futility. Major Wilfred Carson approached, carrying a clipboard and a face lined with sleepless nights. He handed it over without a word. The latest orders were unremarkable. Another dismounted patrol at dawn, reconnaissance in no man's land, and possible coordination with a nearby infantry company. No mention of horses, no hint of mobility, just mud, bullets, and fear. Stroud nodded and tucked the papers into his coat. Carson hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "They're sending some of our remaining mounts to supply units, pack animals. They're not even pretending anymore." Stroud didn't answer. He didn't need to. The cavalry had been unhorsed by modern war, and there was no illusion left to protect. Still, their skills, mobility, awareness, discipline had not vanished. They had simply been repurposed. Men who once trained for open field charges now crawled through shell holes at night, scouting barbed lines and enemy trenches with the same caution and precision once used for reconnaissance in motion. That evening, Lieutenant James Harrow, one of the youngest surviving officers in the brigade, joined Stroud at the mess tent, which was nothing more than a canvas sheet strung between shattered beams. Harrow had come up through the ranks, a quiet observer who had shown grit in the worst moments. He held a letter from home but left it unopened on the table. "Sir," he began, "do you think there's a point anymore? Not just for us, but for all this?" His voice trembled only slightly. Stroud took a moment. The fire cracked beside them, and the smell of weak stew drifted over the sodden air. "There's always a point," he said. "But it isn't always the one you expect when you ride out." He leaned forward, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. "You adapt or you die. The Germans have machine guns and barbed wire. So do we. But a man who can move fast, quietly, and smart, that man still matters. The next morning, they moved out under a gray dawn. Stroud led a scouting party across a churned no-man's land, crawling on hands and knees, mud in every fold of their clothing. Where once they had thundered into battle, now they crept, silent and invisible. It was dangerous, soul-crushing work, listening for enemy whispers, mapping wire placements, avoiding flares. Twice they froze as machine gun nests rattled in the distance, then continued, inching forward like phantoms. At one point, Harrow nearly stepped on a tripwire, but Stroud's gloved hand grabbed him just in time. The younger officer's breath caught, and for a moment their eyes locked. No words, just the mutual understanding that death was always one wrong move away. They marked the trap on their map and moved on, deeper into the wire maze, the war silent around them like a predator holding its breath. By the time they returned, the sun was high and the trenches had shifted with another minor bombardment. Stroud turned in their sketches to the intelligence officer, who barely looked up from his desk. It wasn't glory work, but the information might save a dozen lives, or cost them more if ignored. Stroud didn't wait to find out. He returned to his dugout, where Carson was packing away the last of their saddles. "We're being reassigned," Carson said. "Forward recon with infantry, permanent attachment, no more cavalry command." Stroud felt something in his chest break loose. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was a quiet, aching acceptance. "Then that's what we do," he replied. "We ride no more, but we still lead." He looked out across the trench lines, a no-man's land stretching into the haze. Somewhere out there, beyond the mud and the smoke, the war still waited. Not for horses, not for charges, but for men willing to adapt, endure, and shape something out of ruin. The last remaining horse in their unit, a battered chestnut named Wallace, stood quietly by the latrines, his ribs showing beneath his coat. Stroud approached, ran a hand along the animal's flank, and whispered a soft apology. The past, like the horse, was still with them, but fading. He turned back, shouldering his rifle and nodding to Carson and Harrow. "Let's go. There's still work to do." And so they moved forward, no longer mounted but not diminished, ghosts of a bygone age forging new purpose in a world they no longer recognized. The winter of 1916 had turned the Western Front into a frozen purgatory. The mud, once ankle-deep and clinging, had solidified into jagged ice that tore through boots and flesh alike. Captain Edward Stroud stood atop a frost-coated rise, surveying the ruins of what had once been a farmstead, now reduced to twisted beams and blackened stone. His breath came in ragged clouds, each exhale etched with fatigue and something deeper. An absence, a hollow where certainty had once lived. His men no longer rode. They trudged. The few surviving horses had been reassigned to pull ammunition carts or died in the cold, their bodies buried beneath collapsed dugouts or burned for warmth. The cavalry brigade had been dissolved officially months earlier, merged into reconnaissance platoons and trench raiding units. But among the former horsemen, something had remained intact, a discipline, a cohesion bred from their shared origins and stubborn pride. Lieutenant James Harrow had changed more than most. The war had carved lines into his face that had no right to be there at his age. He no longer waited for orders with a boy's deference. He issued them now with clipped precision, his voice calm even when shellfire rattled the sky. He met Stroud beside a cratered road that once led to Soissons, the map in his gloved hand smudged with ash. "German patrols here and here," he said, tapping points near an abandoned trench network. "If we move through the tree line tonight, we might catch them before they regroup." Stroud nodded. It wasn't bravery anymore. It was calculation, risk weighed against necessity. He glanced at the men waiting behind them, veterans in patched coats and mismatched helmets, rifles slung across their backs, Some still carried cavalry spurs on their boots, not for use, but memory. That night they moved silently through the snow, their outlines blurred by white camouflage cloaks. They passed the remnants of barbed wire fences, now crusted with frost, and the scattered bones of soldiers long buried by time and silence. The forest offered cover but little warmth. Every step was a test of nerve, every crack of a twig a potential death sentence. Halfway through the advance, they encountered resistance, a machine gun nest hidden within a collapsed barn. Stroud gave the signal, and Harrow led a flanking maneuver, moving low and fast through the underbrush. The assault was brutal and short. Grenades first, then rifles. When it was over, the enemy lay still, the snow around them stained black in the moonlight. Harrow wiped blood from his cheek and motioned to the others. "Keep moving, they'll have heard us." They reached the outer trench network just before dawn. The Germans had withdrawn, leaving behind supplies and hastily scrawled notes. Stroud crouched beside a pile of discarded gear, turning over a saddlebag that bore the insignia of a cavalry regiment. German like his own had once been. It struck him then with unexpected force, how the enemy had suffered a similar fate, once proud riders now reduced to foot soldiers, scavengers in a war that had consumed the very tactics it was born from. Back at their forward camp, word came down. Another offensive was being planned near the Somme, and the restructured reconnaissance unit would play a key role. Harrow approached with the details, his breath steaming in the chill air. "We'll be ahead of the main push, mapping German bunkers, identifying weak points, high risk." Stroud studied him for a long moment. "You're ready?" he asked. Harrow's answer came without hesitation. "I was ready 2 years ago. I just didn't know it yet." That night, Stroud sat alone by a dying fire, the embers glowing like distant artillery. He pulled from his satchel an old photo, his cavalry unit, mounted and proud, taken days before the Battle of Mons. The faces smiled back at him from another world. Only a handful were still alive. Some were buried in unmarked graves, others had vanished into hospitals or silence. He didn't mourn the loss of horses or sabers. Those were symbols. What he grieved was the vanishing belief that honor and war could coexist, that men could charge with courage and not be fed into a machine that neither cared for valor nor remembered it. And yet, despite everything, they endured. They learned to adapt, to fight in the shadows, to lead without brass bands or banners. Cavalry had died, yes, but not the men who had lived by its code. They had simply changed uniforms, traded reins for maps, and found new ways to serve in a war that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. In the distance, the rumble of artillery marked the beginning of another day. Stroud rose slowly, his joints stiff, his eyes clear. He would not charge into legend. He would not die on horseback beneath a waving standard. But he would continue, step by step, through snow and mud, leading those still willing to fight, not for glory, but for each other. And in that, perhaps, there was still something noble left.